January 3rd, 1941, Glasgow, Scotland. The air was thick with the remnants of the night's frost, a biting cold that seemed to press against the bones of the city. David McLaren stood on the corner of Buchanan Street, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his threadbare coat. He was only 17, but to the world, he was already a man, too old to be a child, too young to enlist. The newspapers that flapped in the wind above him painted a grim picture. War had swept across Europe, and the air raid sirens that wailed through Glasgow were a constant reminder of how close the enemy was. This was no longer a far-off thing, no longer something to read about in the papers or hear in hushed voices at the pub. This was real, and it was here. David had always been a quiet boy, someone who preferred to fade into the background. His father had been a miner, his mother a seamstress. His childhood had been marked by the hum of hard work, the constant rhythm of survival. But now, in the midst of a world falling apart, survival meant something else entirely. It meant danger in every shadow, in every step. It meant making choices no one his age should ever have to make. That morning, David had been summoned, though not in any official capacity. He had been contacted by a man whose name he didn't know, a man whose face he had never seen. His orders were clear, and they left no room for hesitation. The message had been delivered in a whisper, passed through an anonymous letter dropped in the alley behind the bakery where David worked. It was a simple instruction: meet at the docks at midnight. At first, David had thought it was a prank, the kind of joke some older boys would play to get a rise out of him. But when he saw the stamp, the official seal of the British resistance, his heart had skipped a beat. It was real, too real. David knew that his place in this war, as small as it seemed, was to carry messages, to be the one who moved unseen, who slipped in and out of the shadows with information that could change the course of everything. A courier, an unremarkable job, at least on the surface, but it was one that required a bravery he wasn't sure he had. He wasn't supposed to be a part of this conflict, not officially anyway. He was too young to enlist. His father had written to the army, begging them to take his son. He had even offered to falsify David's birth certificate, but they had refused. In the eyes of the British military, David McLaren was nothing more than a child. But the world didn't care about what the army thought. The world was at war. And in the war, there was no time for labels, no room for formalities. The truth was, someone needed to carry messages. Someone needed to take the risks, to slip past the checkpoints, to cross borders in the dead of night without anyone noticing. David wasn't an extraordinary boy. He wasn't trained in espionage, nor had he spent years in military schools like the young men who fought on the front lines. He had no real understanding of strategy or tactics. He was just a boy who knew how to keep his mouth shut and his head down. But that was enough. That was the one thing that made him useful. His youth made him invisible. He was a ghost. No one would suspect a boy like him. By the time the clock struck midnight and the shadows stretched long across the docks, David had already crossed the streets of Glasgow more times than he cared to count. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his breath almost louder than the faint creaks of the boat moored in the harbor. The cold didn't bother him anymore. There was something else, an edge, a feeling that settled like stones in his stomach. He couldn't help but wonder if tonight was the night he would be caught. If tonight, the world would become smaller, more dangerous. When the man appeared, it was as though he stepped out of the darkness itself. His face was shrouded in a scarf. His eyes narrowed beneath a battered cap. He didn't offer his name. There was no handshake, no pleasantries. Only a simple gesture toward the small rowboat tied at the dock. Without a word, David followed. The boat creaked under their combined weight as they pushed off from the dock, the cold water splashing against the sides. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting everything in a ghostly hue. David held onto the edges of the boat as it rocked gently in the water. There was no turning back now. This was it, his first mission. He had no idea where the journey would lead, but he knew it was too late to question it. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had just stepped into. They navigated the narrow waterway that snaked through the city, keeping to the shadows. It felt like a lifetime before the boat finally docked at a small warehouse. David's guide stepped off first, then turned to offer David a hand. The moment their hands touched, David felt something he hadn't expected: resolve. It wasn't strength or power. It was a deep, undeniable pull that said, "This is who you are now." Inside the warehouse, the silence was heavy. A group of men stood waiting. Their eyes flicked toward David, sizing him up as they stood around a table cluttered with maps and documents. The leader, an older man with a weathered face and steel-gray eyes, gestured for David to approach. He handed him a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The contents inside were simple: coordinates, times, and a list of names. It was all David needed to know. His job was to move the message, to get it past the soldiers, the checkpoints, the Gestapo, to get it to those who could use it to change the tide of war, to those who still believed in resistance. But David wasn't sure if he was ready. He was too young, too scared. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a boy who had never even held a rifle. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, but there was no turning back now. "Take it," the older man said, his voice a quiet whisper, almost a command. "And remember, you're not just carrying these papers. You're carrying something much more important. You're carrying hope." David looked down at the envelope. It was heavier than he had expected. The weight of it wasn't just in the paper. It was in the responsibility, in the lives that depended on its safe arrival. As he turned to leave, the door behind him creaked shut. The air around him seemed to thicken. For a moment, the world outside the warehouse felt like it had disappeared. The sounds of the city, the rhythm of life, seemed far away. David wasn't just a courier anymore. He was part of something much larger than himself. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to carry a secret, to bear the weight of history on his shoulders. His heart raced again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, something sharper. And he knew, in that moment, that this was just the beginning. Wherever he went next, he would carry with him the truth. A truth that could save lives. A truth that, if it reached the right hands, could change the world. And there was no turning back. July 18th, 1942. Paris, occupied France. The city was a ghost of its former self. Beneath the gleaming surface of its boulevards and cafes, the heart of Paris had been hollowed out, suffocated by the cold, calculating grip of the Nazi occupation. It was the kind of city where secrets had a way of slipping between the cracks of history. Silent, invisible, but vital. David McLaren, who had once been just a boy from Glasgow, now found himself embedded deep in the heart of it all, carrying a secret that could change the course of the war. For the past several months, David had worked as a courier in the vast, fragmented network of the French resistance. He was young, practically invisible, which made him the perfect asset. The Gestapo didn't waste their time chasing children, especially not one who blended seamlessly into the crowds of Paris. Yet, in the span of only a few weeks, David had become something more than just a messenger. He had become part of something far larger, a rebellion in the shadows, one that sought to undermine the invaders by any means necessary. His work was dangerous, often terrifying, and yet, with each successful mission, he became more emboldened. The people he met on these covert missions weren't heroes by the typical definition. They weren't soldiers, nor were they celebrated warriors. They were ordinary people, like him, artists, shopkeepers, writers, each driven by a personal desire to resist the tyranny that had invaded their home. David had learned quickly that bravery didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it looked like a seamstress hiding a weapon beneath her skirt, or a mechanic quietly dismantling Nazi trucks in the dead of night. And sometimes, it looked like a 17-year-old boy who had never held a rifle, yet found himself walking through enemy lines carrying messages that could determine the fate of thousands. David wasn't sure exactly when he had stopped being afraid. Maybe it was the first time he had crossed into the occupied zone under the cover of night, slipping past the soldiers like a shadow. Or perhaps it was the moment when he'd handed over a coded message to a man who had told him to trust no one, not even his closest friends. But it wasn't fear that drove him anymore. It was necessity. There was a strange kind of calm that had settled over him, a recognition that what he was doing, no matter how small, no matter how invisible, mattered. Tonight, he was carrying another message. A simple envelope, folded carefully, sealed with the same red wax he had seen on countless others. But this mission was different. It wasn't about simply delivering information to one of the Resistance's safe houses or connecting different factions of the underground network. This was about something far more critical: a set of coordinates, a precise schedule, and the names of high-ranking Nazi officers who had been spotted in a location that could change the entire balance of power in the region. It was the kind of intelligence that could turn the tide in favor of the Allies, if only it reached the right hands in time. The Parisian streets were eerily quiet as David navigated the narrow alleyways. He had crossed this part of the city more times than he could count, but tonight felt different. There was a sense of foreboding, an edge to the air that made his skin prickle. His instincts had sharpened since joining the Resistance. He no longer walked in the carefree way he had in Glasgow. Now, every step was measured, every corner approached with caution. As he approached the rendezvous point, a small café on Rue de Rivoli, he felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket. It was heavier than it should have been. He knew the contents weren't the only thing that made it so. The lives of those who depended on it, the Resistance fighters, the soldiers, the families of both, hung on this piece of paper. He had to get it to the right hands. Failure was not an option. The café's windows were dark, the lights dimmed to avoid drawing attention. Inside, a man sat alone at a table in the back, a French Resistance leader David had met only a few times. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, his face etched with the weariness of war. David couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in his eyes as he nodded toward the door. The man didn't smile. He didn't need to. There was no time for pleasantries. David slipped into the chair opposite the man, tried to ignore the pounding of his heart in his chest. The café was empty, save for a few hushed conversations at the far end. The waiter moved silently between tables, a figure too inconspicuous to be noticed by anyone but the most observant. David slid the envelope across the table. The man's hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, but his gaze never left David's face. "I trust you, McLaren," the man said, his voice low. "But you need to understand, this is bigger than you think. The information you're carrying, it could change everything. Lies are riding on it." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His breath caught in his throat. For the first time in months, he felt the full weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He had become so accustomed to the clandestine world he moved through that he had forgotten the true cost of what they were doing. This wasn't just about secrecy or rebellion or survival. It was about something more. It was about freedom, about breaking the chains that had bound an entire continent in darkness. The man's eyes softened as he glanced down at the envelope. "I'll take it from here. But there's something you need to know, McLaren. There's a price to all of this. A price you might not fully understand yet." David nodded again, though he couldn't bring himself to ask what that price was. He already knew. It was the same price everyone paid when they chose to stand up to tyranny: fear, loss, and the constant shadow of danger. As David rose to leave, a sudden noise echoed from the street outside. A muffled shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the pavement. He froze, eyes wide. The Gestapo had arrived. "Go!" the man hissed, his hand on David's arm. "Don't look back. Don't stop running. You've done your part." David didn't hesitate. He bolted for the door, heart racing as his feet hit the cobblestones. Behind him, he heard the heavy thud of footsteps growing closer. He was exposed. The Nazis were searching for anyone who looked out of place, anyone who might have information about the Resistance. David knew that if he were caught, it wouldn't just be him who paid the price. It would be everyone he had ever worked with, everyone he had ever trusted. His breath came in sharp gasps as he sprinted through the narrow alleys, the sound of pursuit growing louder. He turned a corner, then another, praying for the dark corners of the city to hide him. His pulse pounded in his ears as his legs burned, and yet, in that moment, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now, not when the world depended on him. With each step, he felt the paradox that had come to define his life. A boy who had never asked for this role, now running through the streets of Paris with the fate of thousands in his hands. August 20th, 1945. London, England. The war had ended, the silence hanging heavy over a world that had been forever altered. But David McLaren had not yet returned to the world he once knew. The streets of London, still bearing the scars of the Blitz, were full of life once again. People walking with purpose, their faces set against the future. But for David, there was no simple return, no easing into normality. His war had never been the same as theirs. His was a war of shadows, a war fought on forgotten streets, in the unseen places where history had left no record of those who had bled and died. David had come home, but the world had moved on. No one cared about the boy who had carried messages through occupied Europe, the boy who had made it out of Paris when everyone thought he was lost. No one cared about the couriers, the ones who had slipped through the cracks of history, whose bravery had been overshadowed by the soldiers who fought on the front lines. His story, and the stories of thousands like him, had been erased. The medals were there, of course. A few hastily awarded ribbons that were meant to acknowledge his service, his contribution, but nothing substantial. No parades, no public gratitude, not even a mention in the history books. Instead, David was expected to return to his quiet life in Glasgow, to fade back into the shadows of civilian existence as if he had never been part of something greater, something monumental. As if the war had been fought and won by others, by those who had carried guns and fought battles in open fields. But David could not forget what he had done, what he had been a part of, what he had carried, both the weight of his country's survival and the burden of its secrets. He had been a part of something that could never be spoken of in full, a silent witness to history that was being rewritten even as it happened. The truth of what he had endured, what the couriers had endured, was buried beneath the names of generals and soldiers, the heroes who had been seen in uniform, and not the ones who had moved in and out of occupied cities, the ones who had faced the same dangers but never been given a voice. It was in the quiet moments, those long, sleepless nights, that the weight of it all pressed down on him. The faces of the men and women who had helped him, the ones who had shared their homes and their lives with him, only to be betrayed and captured. Faces of those who had disappeared into the night, leaving no trace. Faces of the people who had never come back, their fates lost in the chaos of the war. For David, the war had never truly ended. The memories of those he had lost, of the missions that had failed, lingered in the corners of his mind, shadows that would never quite fade.